The Library Stamp. Puzzle Story. The Westbridge Special Collections archive lived behind two doors most visitors never saw. The first was glass and polite, with hours posted in gold lettering. The second was steel and silent, opened only after a name was matched to a ledger and a badge. Past that second door, the building changed its personality. The air cooled. The sound softened. Even footsteps seemed to behave. The reading vault was the most controlled space in the archive. One long table. Two desk lamps. A camera mounted above the entrance. No pens, no drinks, no bags. Visitors handled rare items only on foam cradles, under supervision, in gloves provided by staff. Every request slip was stamped and logged. Date, time, item number, seat number, because the archive's currency wasn't money. It was provenance. That Friday, the featured item was a single manuscript, the Ashbourne Folio, a vellum-bound document on loan from a private donor. It wasn't displayed behind glass like most treasures. It was, quote, available for supervised study, which sounded generous until you saw the rules written in small print. Only one reader at a time. No photographs. No exceptions. The approved reader was Dr. Rowan Keats, a visiting researcher known for obsessive patience and meticulous hands. He arrived a few minutes early, signed the entry ledger, and accepted the standard instructions without argument, until he reached the glove policy. He produced, almost sheepishly, a sealed packet from his coat. His own powder-free gloves, hospital grade, the kind people used when they'd been burned once by something harmless. He didn't argue. He just said, mild as weather, I've learned to bring my own. You never really know what's been handled in places like this. Elara Finch, the senior archivist, didn't look up from the ledger when she answered. We provide gloves, no exceptions. Her tone was calm, professional, absolute, gravity, not preference. Rowan smiled, as if surrender were simply another kind of scholarship. Of course, he said, and tucked his packet away. A minute later, the rules softened, not because Elara changed her mind, but because someone with a different kind of authority arrived. Chairwoman Celeste Harrow, the archive's board chair and public face, entered with the practiced brightness of someone who existed to prevent uncomfortable scenes. She greeted Rowan by name, thanked him for visiting, thanked Silas Marin, the donor, for his generosity, and then, still smiling, said pleasantly, if Dr. Keats prefers his own gloves, let's be gracious. We're not in the business of making scholars feel distrusted. Elara's stillness sharpened for half a breath. Then she nodded, as if the decision had always been hers. Rowan took his packet back out. That's kind, he said. Trust is fashionable tonight. Silas's grin widened in the way it always did when someone else validated his importance. He drifted closer to the vault like a man who believed proximity was a form of ownership. He wore a signet ring that caught the light whenever he gestured, as if he wanted the room to remember who had paid for it. And then he did a small thing that should have meant nothing, but didn't feel like nothing. As Elara prepared the vault, Silas reached, almost absent-mindedly, toward the edge of the table, and straightened the gray handling kit so it sat perfectly parallel to the table's seam. It wasn't touching the folio. It wasn't even touching a tool. It was just a donative habit, rearranging the scene as if his room should look right. Elara's eyes flicked to his hand once, sharp as a blade. Please don't, she said softly. Not angry, just final. The kind of voice that warned you she would be polite right up until she wasn't. Silas lifted both hands in the practiced performance of innocence. Of course, he said smiling. Habit. I only want it to look cared for. Mira, the archive's social intern, hovered at the edges with her phone held low, not quite filming, not quite not filming, capturing behind-the-scenes moments for a staff chat no one outside the building would ever see. At 8:54 p.m., Rowan submitted his request slip. Elara stamped it with the archive's red approval mark. The camera above the vault door caught the usual sequence. Elara unlocking the inner cabinet, sliding out the folio in its tray, setting it on the foam cradle at seat 3, then placing the standard tools beside it, bone folder, soft weights, and a pair of nitrile gloves Rowan would not use. Then Elara performed the procedure she treated like scripture, one that most visitors never even noticed because it looked like paperwork, not security. For high-value loans, Westbridge used a 2-stamp chain of custody, the red approval stamp at the time of issue, and a second stamp, smaller, darker, marking the seat number and return line. It wasn't a flourish. It was the vault's way of forcing a clean trail. Only staff knew it existed because only staff cared about how evidence survived human memory. Elara moved with clipped precision. She used a slim metal clip to hold the slip at the corner, never skin on paper if she could help it, then reached toward the stamp station at the far end of the table. The station was an old-fashioned setup donated for atmosphere, a heavy stamp, a wooden blotter, and a small brass shaker that, according to its little plaque, was for setting ink. It looked ceremonial, like the archive's idea of itself. Ilara pressed the small seat stamp once, clean and centered, then used the blotter. No shake, no dust, just blotter and clip, the way she always did. Chairwoman Harrow watched with the satisfied expression of someone who loved optics. "Beautiful," she said, as if procedure were the archive's real exhibit. She leaned in and lightly touched the brass shaker with 2 fingers, rotating it half an inch so the label faced outward. It was nothing. It was the kind of tiny adjustment people made when they wanted a scene to look correct. Silas nodded approvingly. "Real archives still do things properly," he said. "Warm, indulgent." Then he added, with a laugh that sounded friendly and wasn't, "I wish more staff had your standards." It landed like a compliment to Ilara, but it was really a reminder to everyone else who owned the room. Then came the second small thing that looked like nothing. Silas opened the glass case labeled donor materials using a small key on his ring and removed a sealed white envelope stamped with the archive's logo. "Cotton gloves," he said mildly, "the kind vellum deserves." Ilara's expression changed so little it barely counted as a change. The case was supposed to be staff-handled. Donors weren't supposed to use their own keys in the vault, not in front of a reader, not like this. But Silas lived in the gray zone, where rules bent for optics. Rowan glanced at the envelope and gave a faint, amused exhale. "See?" he said, almost to himself. "Even here, everyone wants you to trust what they bring you." Then, louder, polite again, "Thank you." He set the envelope beside the cradle without opening it. He wore his own gloves. At 9:10 p.m., a graduate student in the outer reference room, someone who had handled older boxes earlier, approached the desk and complained that their fingertips felt numb and their lips felt a little weird. It lasted a few minutes. Ilara offered water and a seat, asked if they'd eaten, and when the student shrugged and laughed it off, the moment became what such moments usually become, a story with a comfortable ending. Old paper did that. Dust did that. Archives were intense. The student went home. The staff mentally filed the incident under sensitivities, not threats. In the vault, Rowan worked steadily for nearly half an hour. The camera captured no drama, only slow page turns and careful hands. Silas lingered nearby, occasionally pointing out marginal notes like a man trying not to appear proud. At one point, Silas leaned over the table and, without thinking, moved the white envelope a few inches farther from the folio tray, as if tidying the space for Rowan's comfort. He did it with the same casual entitlement people used when they believed their intentions sanctified their hands. It was harmless. It was almost thoughtful. Ilara looked up so fast it felt like sound. "Don't move anything," she said, still quiet. "Not even paper." Silas froze, then smiled wider. Of course. You're right." He lifted both hands again, palms out, clean, performative, and stepped back with a chuckle that suggested Ilara was being overly intense. It was the kind of interaction that made the room subtly pick sides. Silas as generous, Ilara as rigid. Courtesy versus control. Donor versus gatekeeper. A perfect little bias machine. Chairwoman Harrow lingered too long, then left in the way public figures left, after making sure everyone saw her leave. At 9:37 p.m., Rowan's body language changed. Not theatrically. Just a pause that lasted a beat too long. His shoulders rose as if he were taking a deeper breath than necessary, and he pressed his fingertips together once, as if testing sensation. When Ilara asked if everything was all right, Rowan smiled and said something mild. Fatigue, long day, nothing to worry about. At 9:44 p.m., Rowan closed the folio carefully and stood. Ilara began the end-of-session process. Rowan removed his gloves, his own, and dropped them into the lidded bin by the door. Ilara logged the return of the folio. Silas stepped aside with practiced restraint, as if he were demonstrating that he could behave. Then Ilara did the last procedural step that everyone always forgot was even a step. She slid the request slip toward Rowan and pointed to the return line beneath the small seat stamp. "Sign here," she said. "Routine, flat, bureaucratic. And dry your hands first. No oils on the paper." There was a sanitizer dispenser mounted by the vault exit, archive policy. Rowan pumped a small amount into his palm and rubbed his hands briskly. He took the slip, signed on the return line, and handed it back. Ilara clipped it, squared it with the other forms, and placed the stack into the closing folder. Unremarkable administrative flow. For a fraction of a second, she paused as if listening to the paper itself, because the stack sat a little too perfectly aligned, too cleanly squared, the way it looked when someone else had already arranged it. Rowan walked out alone. The archive's public exit required a short descent down an old iron staircase that wound between stacks like a spine. Rowan started down normally. Halfway, he slowed. A hand reached for the rail. His foot missed a step by what looked like a fraction. Then his body folded into the motion of falling with a strange quietness, as if the decision had been made somewhere else, and his muscles hadn't received the memo. He hit the landing hard. Someone noticed later that the iron rail near the curve held a fresh, glassy sheen, as if it had been wiped clean just recently, despite the building not being due for any cleaning until morning. When staff rushed to him, the scene read like the kind of tragedy old buildings produced. A bad step, a slick rail, a sudden dizzy spell. The camera above the vault door showed Rowan leaving alone. The hallway camera at the stairwell entrance showed no one behind him within reach. Silas and Alara arrived seconds later, not close enough to have touched him. Rowan died before paramedics could move him. The autopsy complicated everything. The injuries matched the fall, but the cause of death did not resolve into blunt trauma alone. Testing confirmed poisoning, fast enough to compromise him before the stairs, subtle enough to hide inside normal handling, ordinary enough to leave no obvious weapon behind. The archive searched anyway. The folio was tested. The cradle was tested. The weights were tested. Air samples came back clean. No tampering was found on the stairs. Rowan had no needle marks, no cuts, no ingestion route. He had not eaten or drunk anything inside the vault. The donor case was wiped down. The sealed envelope of cotton gloves was recovered and tested. Clean. Still sealed. No residue. The sanitizer reservoir was tested too. Standard. Nothing abnormal. And when investigators asked for Rowan's request slip, the one thing he had handled barehanded after sanitizing, Alara opened the closing folder and found the yellow copy still clipped in place, but the white top sheet, the one Rowan had actually gripped and signed, was missing. The yellow copy wasn't blank. It held a faint pressure echo of Rowan's signature, like a ghost of ink, proof that he had signed something, proof that something had been there. Two details remained, stubborn and ordinary. One was the earlier student's numb fingertips, explained away too quickly. The other was a time-stamped image Mira posted to the staff chat at 9:12 p.m., a harmless behind-the-scenes shot of the vault table set for scholarship. In the frame, the foam cradle sat at seat 3, the folio tray was visible, and beside it sat the white glove envelope, fresh and slightly out of place among the archive's gray tools. Most people noticed the envelope and stopped there. But the picture contained something else, so normal it barely registered as a thing. At the far end of the table sat the stamp station, closer to seat 3 than it normally sat. The brass shaker's lid was slightly unseated, as if someone had lifted it and set it down without tightening. And at the edge of the frame, a hand, wearing a Westbridge trustee's signet ring, hovered near the shaker in the shared space between ceremony and control. Silas was the obvious person to blame. He had a key. He had produced the envelope. He had been told twice not to touch things, and kept touching anyway. But Mira's photo didn't prove it was Silas's hand. It only proved that someone with a trustee's ring had touched what no one ever treated as dangerous. Question: if the fall was only the ending, what was the beginning? How was Rowan poisoned in a controlled reading vault where everyone handled the same manuscript, yet only he died? Who was responsible?